Emily Carter had never once stood in line for anything. Not for coffee, not for a taxi, not for a table at a restaurant where reservations were technically required 3 weeks in advance. That was what it meant to carry the Carter name in Boston. Doors opened, queues parted, and the city arranged itself around you like a patient butler adjusting the furniture before you entered a room. She was 26 years old, the only daughter of William Carter III, whose investment firm managed enough capital to make certain senators return phone calls on weekends. She had her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's sharper temper. Her apartment on the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower looked west over the river, and on clear evenings the skyline turned copper in the late light, and she barely glanced at it anymore. She was, by any reasonable accounting, exceptional. She was also, though, she would have argued this vigorously, entirely useless. The trouble started on a Tuesday in March, at the quarterly presentation for the Hargrove acquisition. Emily had been handed the account 3 weeks earlier, not because she had earned it, but because her father believed in what he called trial by fire, a philosophy that worked beautifully when the person being tested bothered to prepare. Emily had not prepared. She had attended 2 of the 4 briefings, skimmed the executive summary on her phone in the elevator that morning, and walked into the boardroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been truly held accountable for anything in her life. The Hargrove representatives, 4 men in dark suits, who had flown in from Chicago, noticed within approximately 8 minutes that she had misread the projected revenue figures, not by a small margin, by a factor that suggested she had confused 2 separate columns in the spreadsheet. The deal did not collapse on the spot. It limped out of the room politely, the way deals do when the other party has decided to take their business elsewhere, but wants to preserve the option of blaming weather delays rather than incompetence. William Carter heard about it before Emily made it back to her office. He was a tall man, her father, with silver at his temples and a stillness in his face that people often mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was the particular composure of someone who had trained himself not to show anger in professional settings, because he had seen what uncontrolled anger cost men in his industry. In private, with his daughter, he occasionally allowed the mask to slip. 3 years, he said, from behind his desk. He did not ask her to sit. 3 years of introductions. Of your name opening doors it took me 30 years to reach. And you couldn't read a spreadsheet. The columns were formatted inconsistently. Emily, she stopped. You didn't read the spreadsheet at all. He folded his hands. I spoke with Marcus. He told me you had your phone on the table during the internal briefing. There was a particular kind of silence that filled a room when William Carter had decided something. Emily recognized it the way you recognize the drop in air pressure before a storm. I've arranged for you to spend some time away, he said. 6 weeks. There's a small town in Vermont, Millhaven. I know the name of a family there. You'll stay in town. You'll find work. You'll live on what you earn. She waited for the rest of it. The part where he told her about the corporate apartment he'd reserved, the allowance that would be quietly deposited, the safety net. No safety net came. Your accounts are frozen as of this afternoon, he said. Your credit cards have a $30 daily limit, which should cover essentials. Your phone plan is downgraded to basic calls, no data. She laughed. It came out wrong, too high, too startled. Dad, you're not serious. He was already looking back at his desk. Margaret will have the bus ticket at the front desk. The bus leaves South Station at 7 tomorrow morning. Emily stood very still. Behind her father's head, through the floor-to-ceiling window, Boston glittered in the afternoon light, like something that belonged entirely to her. It always had. She had never considered what it might mean to leave it. This is a punishment, she said. It's an education, he replied. There's a difference. You'll understand it eventually. She did not sleep that night. The bus took 4 hours and smelled of old upholstery and someone's fast food. Emily sat with her single overnight bag on her lap. She had packed badly. Too many silk blouses, not enough warm layers, and watched the landscape change from highway to something smaller, older, less impressed with itself. Millhaven, Vermont, announced itself with a hand-painted sign at the edge of town that looked like it had not been repainted since 1987. The main street was 4 blocks long. There was a hardware store, a diner with a fogged window, a post office the size of a large closet, and a gas station. The afternoon light was gray and soft, and a light rain had started, not a dramatic city rain with its noise and urgency, but a slow, persistent country rain that had nowhere to be and no intention of stopping. Emily stepped off the bus. The driver handed down her bag without looking at her. The bus pulled away. She stood on the wet sidewalk with her bag and her $30 and her phone that could only make calls, and no one in this town knew her name. It was, she would later acknowledge, the loneliest she had ever felt. Not because she missed particular people, but because for the first time in her life she was standing somewhere that offered her nothing, no advantage, no recognition, no ambient approval. She was simply a woman in the rain with a bag, and the town continued around her with complete indifference. She tried 3 places for accommodation. The first, a small inn on the corner of the main street, had 1 room available at $90 a night. When she slid her credit card across the desk, the woman behind the counter ran it twice, then handed it back with the flat expression of someone who had seen this before. Declined, honey. The second place was above a laundromat and advertised weekly rates on a handwritten index card in the window. The landlord, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Gerald, squinted at her and said the weekly rate was $250 in advance, cash only. She had $30. The third option was a notice board outside the post office that listed a room for rent. She called the number from a payphone. She had not used a payphone since she was 12. And it took her a moment to remember how they worked, and the woman who answered said the room had been taken that morning. Emily stood in the rain outside the post office with her bag and her $30 and her damp silk blouse, and the rain intensified slightly, as if the weather too had decided to make a point. My family sent me here as punishment, she said aloud. She had not meant to say it. There was no one nearby to say it to. It simply came out, the way things do when you have been carrying them in your chest and run out of room. Sometimes, said a voice to her left, being sent away is the only way to find where you truly belong. She turned. A man stood a few feet away on the sidewalk, holding an umbrella low enough to cover not just himself but the small girl at his side. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair flattened by the rain where the umbrella hadn't reached. His jacket was worn at the elbows, genuinely worn, not the artful distressing that cost money in boutique stores, and his boots were the kind bought for durability rather than appearance. He had steady gray eyes, and the particular economy of movement of someone who had learned not to waste anything. The girl beside him was 8, maybe 9, with her father's eyes and a yellow raincoat that was the brightest thing in the entire street. Emily looked at him. Then she did what she always did when confronted with something she didn't understand. She laughed. It came out sharp, dismissive. The laugh of someone who has decided that being condescended to by a stranger in a worn jacket in a town she'd never heard of was not something she was willing to engage with. That's very poetic, she said, and picked up her bag. She walked half a block before she realized she had nowhere to walk to. His name was Daniel Brooks. He worked at the lumber yard on Route 9, a 20-minute drive out of town, and he had lived in Millhaven for the past 4 years. He did not volunteer any of this immediately. He offered, instead, the practical fact that the Carver Inn on the far end of town sometimes let rooms for $40 if you knew to ask for the off-season rate, and that the woman behind the desk there was his neighbor and would likely take a check on delayed terms if Emily needed it. Emily said she was fine. It continued to rain. The girl in the yellow raincoat, Lily, looked up at her with the direct, uncalibrated attention that children give to people they find interesting, and said, "You have wet shoes." "I know," Emily said. "Your shoes aren't for rain," Lily observed. "They're pretty, though." Emily looked down at her ruined Italian leather flats and felt something shift in her chest that she could not immediately name. "Thank you," she said. Daniel looked at her for a moment, with the careful, measuring expression of someone doing a quiet calculation. "We have a spare room," he said. "Nothing special. Old couch that folds out. You'd be welcome to use it tonight while you sort things out. I don't need charity." "It's not charity." Lily was going to make soup anyway. "You'd just be one more bowl." Lily confirmed this with a nod of great seriousness. "It's tomato," she said, "from a can, but Dad puts real basil in it." Emily stood in the rain with her wet shoes and her declined credit card and her aristocratic conviction that accepting help from strangers was a form of defeat, and understood slowly that she did not in fact have another option. Not tonight. Not in this rain. One night, she said. The house was a 10-minute walk from the center of town, down a road that narrowed between old maple trees, whose branches arched overhead. It was small, a 2-bedroom clapboard with a deep porch, and the porch needed painting. The garden had gone mostly to seed in the last weeks of winter, though someone had cut the grass and stacked split firewood against the side wall in a way that suggested care. Inside, it was warm. That was the first thing Emily noticed. Genuinely warm. The kind that comes from a house where someone lights the wood stove before leaving in the morning so it's still going when they return. There were books on a shelf by the door, actual books, many of them clearly read, their spines creased. A child's drawings were tacked to the kitchen wall in a long, irregular row. The table had 3 chairs, 2 matched, one slightly different, as if it had been added later, and there was a small lamp on the counter that cast everything in a yellow light that was almost aggressively domestic. Emily set down her bag and looked at the lamp, and thought, "This looks like a place where someone actually lives." She was not sure why that struck her as remarkable. The soup was, as advertised, tomato from a can, with basil, from a small pot, on the windowsill. Daniel made it without ceremony while Lily set the table with a focused efficiency that looked rehearsed, the kind that comes from a child who has been helping with dinner since she was old enough to carry a bowl without spilling. They ate with the radio on low in the background. The conversation was ordinary. Lily was learning long division. Daniel had spent the afternoon helping restack inventory at the yard, after a delivery came in wrong. Emily kept waiting for them to ask her something. Why she was here, who her family was, what had happened. They didn't. They talked to each other, and included her in the way you include a person at a table naturally, without production. And Emily sat with her soup and felt, for reasons she could not explain, deeply, inexplicably uncomfortable. She was not used to being included without being seen, without being recognized, without her context preceding her. She went to sleep on the fold-out couch at 10 o'clock, which was 3 hours earlier than she had slept at any point in the previous 5 years. And she lay in the dark, listening to the rain on the roof, and thought about what her father had said. "You'll understand it eventually." She did not understand it. Not yet. She stayed a second night, then a third. She told herself each time it was temporary. She told herself she was simply waiting to sort out the logistics, find a room, find some kind of work. Get through the 6 weeks and go home. The narrative she maintained was one of an intelligent woman managing a difficult situation with pragmatic flexibility. But the truth, which she was not yet ready to examine directly, was simpler. She did not want to leave the warm house with the lamp on the counter and the child's drawings on the wall. Her days acquired a shape. Daniel left for the lumber yard at 6:15. Every morning she heard him moving in the kitchen, quiet and efficient, the smell of coffee reaching the fold-out couch before she was properly awake. Lily left for school at 7:40, wearing the yellow raincoat whether or not it was raining, apparently on principle. The house was Emily's from 8 until 3. She did not know what to do with this. She had never had unstructured hours. Her Boston life had been all surface and motion meetings, events, restaurants. The performance of busyness that she had mistaken for purpose. Here there was nothing to perform for. She washed her coffee cup because there was no one to wash it for her. She walked into town because there was nothing else to do, and she needed air. She learned, after asking the woman at the hardware store, that there was a part-time opening at the diner. She applied. She did not get it. The owner, a laconic man named Pete, took one look at her and said she didn't have any service experience, but the act of applying was itself foreign enough to feel significant. Lily had an instinct for teaching that was entirely self-appointed. On the 4th day, she found Emily standing in the kitchen looking at a pot of water, with the faint expression of someone confronting an unfamiliar technology. "Have you made pasta before?" Lily asked. "I've ordered pasta," Emily said. "That's not the same. I'm aware of that." Lily pulled a stool to the counter, climbed up, and began explaining with the patient, slightly pedantic tone of an 8-year-old who has recently mastered something and would like to share the mastery. Boil the water first. Salt it, actually salt it, more than you think. The pasta goes in when the water is really boiling, not just warm. You stir it at the start so it doesn't stick. Emily made notes on her phone. Old instinct. Why are you writing it down? Lily asked. So I remember. You'll remember if you do it enough times. Lily handed her the wooden spoon, with the gravity of a surgeon transferring an instrument. You learn things by doing them. That's what Dad says. Emily thought about the Hargrove presentation, about the briefing she had sat through with her phone on the table, about all the things she had been given the opportunity to learn and had declined to learn because there had always been someone else available to do the learning for her. Your dad says a lot of things, she said. He's usually right, Lily said, without any particular emphasis, in the tone of a child who has had enough years to verify the hypothesis. In the evenings, Daniel came home and cooked dinner, or they ate something Emily had attempted, which in the early days meant the results were uneven. He worked with a quietness she found initially unnerving and gradually came to appreciate. He did not fill silence for the sake of filling it. He listened when she spoke and answered when asked, and the answers were direct without being curt, and he never once asked her about money or Boston or what she was doing in Millhaven. She found herself, on the 7th evening, asking him instead. Don't you find it difficult? She said. They were on the porch after Lily had gone to bed, each with a cup of tea. The night cool and starry in the way Vermont nights can be when the clouds clear, running everything alone. He considered this. Some days, he said. But difficult and bad aren't the same thing. You used to be an engineer, she said. She had heard this from Lily, who had offered it casually. The way children offer family information without understanding its weight. He nodded. In Portland. Software architecture. Good company. Good salary. He turned the mug in his hands. When Claire died, Lily was 4. I tried to manage it. Keep working, keep the schedule, keep Lily in daycare. But I was traveling half the month, and Lily needed. He stopped. She needed a parent. Not an arrangement, so you left. I left, and came here. My grandfather owned this house. It needed work. I needed something to do with my hands. He looked out at the dark garden. The lumber yard pays less than I'd like, but I'm here when Lily comes home from school, and she knows where I am. He glanced at her. That turned out to matter more than I expected. Emily held her tea. Through the kitchen window, she could see the lamp on the counter, still on. She started, and stopped. What? She shook her head. Nothing. She was not ready to say it. That she had never been certain where anyone was. That her father's schedule had been communicated through an assistant. That her mother had left when Emily was 10, and the departure had been explained with the brisk efficiency of a boardroom restructuring. That she had grown up in an enormous house full of staff and art, and the muffled absence of anyone who simply sat on a porch and knew where they would be tomorrow. She went inside and washed up and lay on the fold-out couch for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and thought about the lamp. On the 11th day, Emily had an idea. It was, she recognized in retrospect, the kind of idea that comes from good instincts poorly calibrated. She had been watching the town with the analytical detachment of someone who had spent years adjacent to business strategy, and she had noticed several things. The diner was inefficient, the hardware store's inventory system was antique, and Daniel's lumber yard, from what she could gather, was one of 3 competing yards within driving distance, but had no visible online presence or marketing. She spent a morning drafting a proposal on her phone, no data plan, but she could still write offline and presented it to Daniel over dinner with the barely suppressed enthusiasm of someone who has found a problem they know how to solve. He read it carefully. He was a careful reader. He set it down on the table and was quiet for a moment. The yard's margins are thin, he said. It's not a marketing problem, it's a supply chain problem. The bigger yards get volume discounts we can't match. If you built visibility, you'd bring in customers we can't price compete for. He said it gently, but clearly. They'd come once, compare prices, go to Harlan's. Emily opened her mouth. I'm not dismissing it, he said. The instinct is right. But you're solving for the visible problem, not the underlying one. She left the table too quickly. She told herself she needed air. She walked 3 blocks to the diner and sat at the counter and ordered coffee from a woman named Patrice, who was approximately 60, and who regarded Emily with the frank assessment of someone who has seen many varieties of person pass through a small town and classified them quickly. "You're the one staying with Daniel Brooks," Patrice said. "Not a question. I'm renting the room." "Uh-huh." Patrice refilled the coffee without being asked. "You're from money. Is it that obvious? You hold your coffee cup like something might spill on you." Patrice leaned on the counter. "Honey, this is a town. People notice things. Don't take it as an insult. How do people take it? Depends on what you do next." Patrice moved away to take another order. And that was, apparently, that. The next morning, Emily went back to the diner and asked Pete if he'd reconsider the opening. She offered to work a trial shift for free. Pete looked at her for a long time, the way he apparently looked at most things, and said she could start Friday. He said if she broke more than 3 plates in a shift, she was done, and she said she wouldn't break any plates. And he laughed once, briefly, as if she'd said something unintentionally funny. She broke 1 plate on Friday. She did not break any on Saturday. On Sunday morning, she arrived for the early shift, and Patrice was already there and said nothing, just handed her an apron, which felt, in its wordless way, like a form of acceptance. But the evening after her first real shift, tired in a way she had not been in years, feet aching, smelling of coffee and griddle oil, she walked home through the early dark and felt an unfamiliar emotion that took her the full 10-minute walk to identify. Satisfaction. Clean, earned, ordinary satisfaction. She had not known how long she had been living without it. The fight happened on a Wednesday. Emily had been in Millhaven for 3 weeks. She had begun to relax into something not comfort exactly, but familiarity, the grooves of a new routine. She worked 3 mornings a week at the diner. She helped Lily with her reading in the evenings. She had started, with considerable clumsiness, to help Daniel with minor repairs around the house, painting the porch rail, which required 3 coats, and the discovery that she had been holding the brush wrong. She thought this was progress. She thought Daniel could see it was progress. What she had not understood, and would not understand until it was too late to stop the argument, was that Daniel was watching her differently than she imagined. It started with the lumber yard. She had gone back to the idea, refined it, presented a second version that she thought addressed his supply chain objection. She had spent 2 days on it. She was proud of it. Daniel looked at it again. He was quiet in the way that she was beginning to learn. Sometimes meant he was choosing his words, and sometimes meant he was choosing not to say them. "You talked to Frank Bellamy," he said. Frank Bellamy owned the competing yard on the highway. Emily had driven out to it on a day off to do what she thought of as market research. "I just asked him some questions," he told Pete. Pete told my neighbor. Daniel set down the proposal. "Emily, this is a small town. You can't drop into people's businesses and ask questions about their operations and have it not get back. I was trying to help. I know." His voice was even, but something in it had tightened. "But you don't know this place. You've been here 3 weeks. Frank Bellamy and I have been navigating a complicated working relationship for 4 years, and you went in there and told him you were a consultant helping the Brooks yard." "I didn't say consultant. You gave him your business card." She had. Old habit. She had found 2 in the bottom of her bag. "You handed a competitor a card that says Carter Group, Boston," Daniel said. "Do you understand what that looks like from where Frank Bellamy is standing? I was trying to help your business. I didn't ask you to." He said it carefully. "I'm not a problem you came here to solve." The words landed in a way she hadn't prepared for. "That's not what I think of you," she said. "Isn't it?" He wasn't angry, exactly. That was the terrible part. He was clear. "You came here looking for a way to be useful that felt like what you know. Strategy, analysis, the things that make you feel like yourself. I understand that, but you kept doing it after I told you it wasn't what the situation needed." Emily stood very still. The town doesn't need saving. I don't need saving. He picked up the proposal and set it face down on the table. What you're doing is kind. But it's also... He searched for the word. It's managing distance. You're helping from a distance because that's safer than actually being here. She went to her room. 20 minutes later, she came back out, got her jacket, and walked out into the night. It was raining. Of course it was raining. She walked without direction, past the diner and the hardware store, and the dark post office, and the sign at the edge of town that looked even sorrier in the rain, and she felt furious and humiliated. Underneath both of those feelings, the much more uncomfortable sensation of recognizing that he was right. She walked for 40 minutes before she found herself on the highway overpass, looking down at the empty road below. She wasn't thinking anything dramatic. She was simply wet and tired, and standing where the walking had taken her. On the other side of the overpass was a pull-off where a man had parked his truck. He was not a young man, perhaps 65, in a heavy canvas coat, and he was standing at the tailgate pulling grocery bags out of the bed. As Emily watched, he pulled out 2 more bags than she would have expected for a single person, crossed the highway, and climbed down the embankment to where a smaller road disappeared into trees. She watched him go. She watched him reappear a few minutes later, without the bags. Curious, despite herself, she crossed and looked down the smaller road. At the end of it, a light was on in a house she hadn't noticed before. A very small house, not much more than a cabin, set back in the trees. She could see through the kitchen window, an elderly woman receiving something from the man in the canvas coat. The woman was smiling. The man was waving it off. The universal gesture of "it's nothing." "Don't mention it." He passed Emily on his way back to his truck. He nodded at her. "Neighbor," he said, by way of explanation, and got in his truck and drove away. She stood in the rain and understood something that Daniel had been trying to tell her, but that she had not been willing to receive as a teaching rather than a judgment. She had spent 3 weeks helping in ways that made her feel effective. That preserved her sense of self as someone who contributed strategically, analytically, from a position of competence. She had been in Millhaven with her bag half-packed, metaphorically, if not literally, always one step removed from belonging to it. The man in the canvas coat had not made a project of his neighbor. He had simply brought groceries. He had not arrived with a plan to fix the infrastructure of the woman's life. He had seen that she needed something, and had provided it, and then had gone home. You're helping from a distance because that's safer than actually being here. Emily walked back to Daniel's house. The lights were out except for the kitchen lamp still on, always on, and she let herself in quietly and sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the yellow light. When she heard Lily cough from down the hall once, then twice, she got up without thinking and went to check. The fever had come up fast. Lily's forehead was hot, and she was half awake, disoriented, looking for something that wasn't in her room. Emily sat on the edge of the bed and put a cool hand against her cheek and said, "Hey, I've got you." She said it the way she had heard nurses say it once, and in a hospital waiting room when she was 16, and her father was in surgery. The absolute calm of someone making themselves into a fixed point for someone who is frightened. Lily's eyes focused. "You're still here," Lily said, slightly delirious with the fever. "I'm still here," Emily said. She sat with her through the night. Daniel came out at 2 in the morning, drawn by some parental instinct, and found Emily in the bedside chair with Lily's hand in hers. He stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. In the morning, when the fever had broken and Lily was sleeping peacefully and the room smelled of eucalyptus and cool water, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and made coffee and set a cup in front of Emily without being asked. "About last night," she started. "You came back," he said. "That's what matters." She wrapped both hands around the mug and drank, and did not say anything else, and neither did he, and the lamp was still on even though the morning light had made it unnecessary. The last 2 weeks in Millhaven were different. Not transformed, she had not become a different person, and would not claim to have, but recalibrated. She had stopped managing her involvement from a slight elevation. She had started simply being present. At the diner, Patrice began letting her run the counter alone on Sunday mornings, which was the busiest shift and required a kind of cheerful efficiency Emily had never previously associated with herself. She learned the regular orders Harold from the gas station took his eggs over, easy with no toast. The woman who walked her dog past at 7:30 always wanted a large coffee to go. The two retired teachers who came in together on Sundays split the French toast. She remembered these things because she was paying attention. And paying attention, it turned out, was largely a matter of deciding that things were worth paying attention to. She helped Daniel sand and repaint the porch. This took 4 days of working an hour or two each evening after dinner, and involved a lengthy disagreement about the correct sequence for primer versus base coat, and they were both wrong in different ways and right about different parts, and eventually they produced a porch that was not perfect but was solidly better than it had been. Lily recovered from her fever and spent a full Saturday teaching Emily to play a card game she had invented herself, the rules of which were baroque and subject to revision at Lily's discretion. Emily lost 3 times and suspected the 4th game had also been managed against her, but could not prove it, and Lily maintained perfect innocence throughout. She began to know the town's rhythms, the delivery truck that came Tuesday mornings, the way the light changed in the late afternoon when weather was building over the hills, Gerald from the laundromat, who turned out to be less laconic than initially presented and had strong opinions about local history, the family 2 streets over who had 3 dogs and a loose gate, and whose dogs visited the porch at regular intervals, and who Daniel fed quietly so as not to officially encourage. She began to know what it felt like to be somewhere, rather than passing through it. On a Saturday 3 weeks in, a woman named Rita from the general store flagged her down on the street and said she'd heard Emily was good with numbers. Patrice had apparently mentioned this and asked if she'd be willing to look at the store's quarterly expenses, which were confused. Emily said she could look. She looked. The expenses were confused because Rita had been tracking 2 separate suppliers under the same line item for 3 years. Emily fixed it in an afternoon, explained it clearly, and declined payment. "At least take the bread," Rita said, pressing a loaf into her hands. "Thank you," Emily said, and meant it differently than she would have 3 weeks ago. She did not miss Boston. This surprised her. She missed coffee that was made a particular way. And she missed a specific view of the river at dusk. And she missed 2 or 3 friends whose names she now felt mild shame at having neglected for years. But the ambient anxiety of her previous life, the performance, the positioning, the constant management of how she was perceived, she did not miss at all, and this absence felt less like deprivation than like something being cleaned from a surface she hadn't known was dirty. She and Daniel had conversations now that were not about anything in particular walking back from the diner, standing on the painted porch, and these conversations had a quality she recognized from novels she had read in college and thought were somewhat sentimentalized. She had thought authors overestimated the significance of the ordinary. She was revising this view. One evening she asked him if he ever missed Portland. Parts of it, he said. The lake, some friends, the work itself sometimes. He thought about it. But I didn't move away from Portland. I moved toward this. That's a different feeling. How do you know the difference? He considered. One of them keeps looking backward. She said nothing. But she turned the phrase over in her mind for days. Her father arrived on a Friday afternoon. She saw the car from the diner window dark, rented. The particular sheen of something driven up from a major airport. And knew it before the door opened. He emerged in a coat she recognized. A charcoal wool that he wore for what he internally categorized as informal occasions, and he stood on the sidewalk and looked at the main street of Millhaven with an expression she could not read from 30 yards away through glass. She took off her apron and told Patrice, and went outside. "You look different," her father said. He studied her. "Tired." "I'm not tired. I work early shifts." That's what I said. They sat on the porch of Daniel's house. Because there was nowhere else particularly appropriate, and because Emily did not feel the need to find anywhere more impressive. Her father sat in the chair that Lily usually used, the one with the slight wobble, and looked at the garden without commenting on it. "How did you know where I was?" she asked. "I spoke with a woman named Patrice. She told me to bring a decent bottle of wine next time I visit. She's not wrong." He was quiet for a moment. He had the manner of a man who had prepared for a conversation and was now revising based on the actual data in front of him. I expected you to have called me by now, he said, asking to come home. Yes, I thought about it, she said. Around the second week. What stopped you? She looked at the maple trees at the end of the road. I got a job, she said. I broke one plate on the first shift, and none after that. I felt like that was worth seeing through. Her father looked at her for a long moment. And Daniel Brooks, he said. You arranged for me to stay here, she said. It was not a question. She had worked this out gradually over the past week, fitting the pieces together. Her father had said, I know the name of a family there. He had known about the spare room. He had known Daniel specifically. He went to MIT, her father said. We met at a conference years ago. He was brilliant. I've kept loose track of him. He turned his coat collar down. I thought a person who had voluntarily given up a successful career to raise his daughter in a small town might have things to teach you that I couldn't. Did you tell him who I was? I called him. I explained the situation. He paused. He said he'd make the room available if you needed it. He said he wouldn't treat you as a project. She thought about the first night, the soup, the way neither Daniel nor Lily had asked her a single intrusive question, the deliberate, patient normalcy of it. He kept it, she said. He would. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what I want to do, she said. When I come back. If I come back to the firm, and I don't want to do acquisitions. I want to work with the small business portfolio. The community investment side. She had been shaping this thought for days, tentative and becoming less so. I've been watching how money and lack of it work in a place like this. Not abstractly, actually watching. And I think I've been working at the wrong scale. Her father said nothing for a long time. He looked at the garden in the early evening light. Rita at the general store, Emily added. She had a bookkeeping error that had compounded over 3 years. I fixed it in an afternoon. She gave me bread. Her father made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Was the bread good? He asked. It was very good bread, she said. He nodded. Once, slowly, in the way of a man who had gotten something he hoped for but had not been entirely certain of. I'll fly back Monday, he said. Come home when you're ready. Not come home now. Not here is the schedule. When you're ready. She watched his car pull away in the early dark and stayed on the porch until the cold made her go inside. She stayed another week. She had told herself she needed the extra time to finish out her shifts at the diner and to complete a second pass on Rita's books that she had promised to do. These were true reasons. They were not the whole reason. On her last full day in Millhaven, Lily made her help bake something that was described as banana bread, but contained, in Lily's interpretation, a generous amount of chocolate chips and a cinnamon quantity that exceeded any standard recipe recommendation by a factor of approximately 3. The result was extraordinary. They ate it at the kitchen table in the afternoon, and the kitchen smelled of warm sugar and cinnamon, and Lily talked continuously about a book she was reading, and Emily listened and thought, I have spent almost no time in my life listening to someone who had nothing to gain from my attention. It was not a sad thought. It was motivating. That evening, Daniel made dinner properly. A real dinner. Pasta, with a sauce he'd been developing since Emily mentioned that his first version needed more acid, and they ate as the last of the afternoon light went golden through the kitchen window. You've been different this week, Daniel said. Good different or bad different? He considered. Settled, he said. Like you've made a decision. I have, she said. I'm going back on Thursday. But I'm going to try to come back in the summer, if she stopped. She was not entirely certain how to phrase what she was offering without it sounding either too much or too little. You're welcome, he said simply. Lily will make you lose at cards. Lily cheats. Lily is creative with rules, he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it that was entirely different from what she would have recognized as warmth 3 weeks ago, larger, more specific, the warmth of a person who has been surprised in a good way and is still adjusting to it. After dinner, they sat on the painted porch, her work, his work, both of them with tea, and Lily sat between them on the step for a while before announcing that she was going to bed without being asked, which Emily had learned was something Lily only did when she was very content. When Lily had gone inside, Emily said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About moving towards something instead of away." Daniel looked at the dark garden. "I think for a long time I was moving away from things I didn't want to feel," she said. "The expectations. The distance from my father. The sense that everything I had was conditional on performing correctly." She turned the mug in her hands. "I've been treating my life as a problem to manage. And now, I don't know what toward looks like yet. But I think I know what it feels like." She looked at the lamp visible through the kitchen window. Still on, always on. "This," she said, "something like this." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You fixed the porch." "We fixed the porch. You fixed it mostly. I handed you the wrong brush on day 2, and you used it anyway, and it worked." "It worked because you knew to let it work," she said. "You didn't tell me it was the wrong brush. You were doing fine with it." She laughed, a real one, low and unguarded. The kind she had not known she had. "I'll remember that for the report I have to write my father." "He asked you to write a report?" "He asked me to tell him what I'd learned." She glanced at Daniel. "What should I tell him?" He thought about it for what felt like a long time, long enough that the dark had fully settled and the first stars were clear above the maple trees. "Tell him you learned to hold a brush," he said, "and that it worked." She left on Thursday morning. Patrice hugged her, which she had not expected, and Gerald from the laundromat waved from his doorway, and Rita pressed another loaf of bread into her hands and said, "See you in July," which was an assumption Emily found she did not want to correct. Lily walked her to the bus stop. At the stop, Lily hugged her with both arms around her waist, the way children hug completely, without calculation, and said into her jacket, "You can have the same room in summer." "Thank you," Emily said. "I'll be here." She meant it. The bus arrived and she got on and found her seat and put her bag in the overhead rack and sat down and looked out the window. The maple trees. The hand-painted sign at the edge of town. The road narrowing between old buildings and then opening out to highway. She watched the town until it was gone. Then she took out her phone. She had bought a new data plan at the gas station, a thing she had put off for weeks without fully understanding why, and typed a message to her father. "Coming home Thursday. Have some thoughts about the community portfolio. Also learn to paint a porch. Will explain." She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she deleted "will explain" and wrote it was a good 6 weeks instead. She pressed send and watched Vermont go past the window. Green and gray and ordinary, and hers in a way she could not yet quite articulate but would, she thought, spend some time trying to. The bus moved south, and she sat with her bread and her thoughts and the quiet, undramatic feeling of someone who has found their footing in a place they didn't expect to stand. It was not the life she had been given. It was, finally, the one she was beginning to choose.